In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world softens and the streets of memory open like long, unbroken corridors, the story of Eduardo de Valfierno begins without ceremony, without the clear outline that history usually grants to its chosen figures. He arrives instead as a faint silhouette, born somewhere in the warm and restless air of late 19th century Argentina, where the port city of Buenos Aires threw its lights across muddy streets and wooden shacks, and where the boundary between truth and invention was blurred not by philosophy but by necessity. There, in the backrooms of markets and the narrow alleyways where traders whispered prices that shifted with the day's moods, a quiet boy learned to listen more than he spoke, watching how men crafted themselves with gestures, tones, and stories as easily as carpenters shaped wood. His birth name would fade with time, as if even his earliest identity sensed it was only a temporary mask, a fragile skin soon to be shed. What remained was an aura, a composure, a kind of calm observation that set him apart long before he understood its value. Children around him boasted loudly. He absorbed their boasts with the stillness of a mirror. Adults lied to one another. He watched how easily those lies passed, slipping through the air like harmless smoke. He was not yet a man, not yet a thinker, but something in him recognized the fluidity of the world, the way people carried truths they barely inspected and illusions they embraced with comforting familiarity. It was in this landscape of shifting identities that the seeds of his own would take root. As he grew, he found himself drawn to the margins of society where performance mattered more than substance. The traveling peddlers who arrived with wagons full of questionable goods fascinated him, not for the objects they sold but for the rituals of persuasion they performed. Each gesture, each pause, each confident proclamation formed part of a delicate choreography, and he realized that what people trusted was never the object itself, but the certainty with which it was presented. A bottle of tonic became miraculous because a man declared it so. A trinket became precious because someone wanted it to be. These lessons came quietly, forming a kind of unspoken scripture in his mind. He learned that identity, value, and belief were threads woven through the same loom. He also learned the art of invisibility, slipping through crowds without drawing attention, observing transactions, betrayals, reconciliations, and the ceaseless dance of human ambition. In these early years he was not yet Eduardo de Valfierno, not yet the man who would one day orchestrate one of the strangest art crimes ever conceived. He was simply a youth, absorbing the atmosphere of a world where everyone played a role and truth was just one mask among many. The nickname came later, as nicknames often do, attached loosely at first, then settling into place like a second skin. They called him the Marquis, spoken sometimes with admiration, sometimes with irony, but always with a touch of mystery. It was never clear who first uttered it. One day it simply hovered around him, passed from lips to ears as easily as any rumor. The origin of the name was not nobility, for he possessed none. It was not wealth, for his pockets held little. It was not lineage, for he came from no house of grandeur. It was appearance, composure, the way he carried himself as though he had designed his own presence with the care of a painter layering shades onto a canvas. He spoke softly and without urgency. His clothes, though modest, were chosen with precision, clean, pressed, and worn with a sense of quiet dignity. He gave the impression of belonging to a class that had never known disorder, even though he came from streets that breathed with it. The nickname stayed because it suited him, because it captured the contradiction at the heart of his existence, a man without heritage, adopting the air of one who possessed centuries of it. The title was a compliment and a disguise, a joke and an omen. It foreshadowed the future path he would take, where identity itself would become a tool, and appearances would form the architecture of his ambitions. As a young man, he drifted into the bustling centers of Buenos Aires, where immigrants from distant continents mingled with locals in theaters, cafes, and markets brimming with noise and expectation. There he encountered storytellers, card players, illusionists, and small-time tricksters whose skills fascinated him more than any formal education could have. Each encounter added another layer to his understanding of human nature. He saw how easily a well-dressed man could command respect, how a confident lie could be mistaken for truth, and how people frequently sought certainty in the very places where deception thrived. He discovered early that the world was less concerned with what a person was than what a person appeared to be. If he projected the calm authority of a nobleman, then a nobleman he became in the eyes of others. If he claimed knowledge he did not possess, people often granted it to him, filling in the spaces with their own assumptions. This realization, subtle yet profound, became the quiet foundation upon which his later schemes would rise. Time passed, and with it came broader horizons. The docks of the city, with their endless flow of ships, seemed to offer escape and possibility. He watched sailors unload crates labeled with destinations he had only heard whispered: Valparaiso, Havana, Marseille. The world extended far beyond the narrow rooms and dusty streets of his upbringing. He began to imagine himself walking through the avenues of Europe, stepping into galleries he had only seen in pictures, shaking hands with people who spoke languages he had yet to learn. But more than the places themselves, he was drawn to the idea of reinvention. Distance, he sensed, allowed transformation. A man who stepped onto a ship could disembark in another country as someone entirely new. The past loosened its grip when crossed by ocean water. And so, with the quiet determination that had always guided him, he moved steadily toward the life he envisioned, crafting himself with each passing year into a figure of elegance, confidence, and enigma. The early signs of what he would become were already visible to those who watched closely. He rarely revealed emotion, yet he listened with such intensity that others mistook it for empathy. He spoke rarely, yet when he did, his words carried weight. He showed no interest in brute force or direct confrontation. He preferred subtle maneuvering, the kind that left no fingerprints behind. He was drawn to objects of value, not for their material worth, but for the stories attached to them. A well-made frame fascinated him as much as the painting it held. A signature intrigued him as much as the art it authenticated. He understood early that value was not inherent but assigned, and once assigned, it could be manipulated. These observations formed the quiet blueprint of his character, though no one, least of all he, could yet imagine the scale of the deception he would one day choreograph. As youth softened into adulthood, he left behind the dusty backdrop of his beginnings and stepped more fully into the persona of the Marquis. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible to those around him, like a shadow lengthening as the sun moves across the sky. He refined his posture, his speech, his manners. He learned to navigate social spaces where wealth flowed freely, where men discussed investments and art and global ventures. He developed a taste for refinement, though his means remained modest. But he carried himself with the assurance of someone who belonged, and often that was enough. He grew to understand that he could move between worlds, slipping from the company of laborers to that of self-made aristocrats without raising suspicion. The fluidity of his identity became his greatest asset. Yet beneath all this polish and poise, a question whispered within him. How far could he push the illusion? How complete could the mask become before it fused with the face beneath it? This question lingered in the quiet spaces of his mind, shaping his ambitions, urging him towards something bold enough to match the persona he had crafted. The world was wide, and he felt its pull with increasing intensity. The time for small observations was passing. The time for action was approaching, though its form remained as indistinct as the shifting patterns of light on water. It is here, in this subtle tension between what he was and what he aimed to become, that the lingering image forms. A young man stepping through a doorway at dusk, the light falling behind him, his silhouette poised between shadow and possibility. The door closes quietly, almost gently, as though sealing away the fragments of a past he no longer intends to carry. And in that stillness, with the air cooling around him and the night beginning to breathe, Eduardo de Valfierno walks forward into the vastness of a world ready to be shaped by the mind of a man who has only begun to understand the power of illusion. The faint sound of that closing door lingers like a thin echo stretched across the years, and as it fades, it reveals the next chamber of his life, a place where the young man who once walked silently through crowded markets begins to understand the deeper machinery of the world. Eduardo de Valfierno stepped into adulthood with the calm countenance of someone who had always known that the self was malleable, that the truth people accepted was often the one presented with the greatest composure. Yet even with this early intuition, he had not yet encountered the lesson that would define his path, the realization that the world, with all its rules and structures, could be bent not by force, but by a kind of confident suggestion. This understanding came gradually, like the soft rise of a tide, gathering strength through subtle experiences that would eventually converge into one clear principle. In his early 20s, he moved through circles where ambition was worn like a tailored suit and where deception was not an art but a commodity. He met men who traded in illusions, selling worthless plots of land to hopeful immigrants, or counterfeit jewelry to the newly rich, who wanted their prestige to sparkle a little brighter. He observed how these schemes succeeded not because the products were convincing, but because the desire of the buyer filled in the gaps. People wanted to believe, and that longing made them vulnerable. This was the first revelation that took root in him. The quiet awareness that belief itself was a kind of currency, one that could be earned, borrowed, or stolen. He saw that illusions, when crafted with patience, could become more powerful than facts. One evening, in a dim cafe near the port where gamblers and small-time swindlers gathered to exchange news, he watched a man named Pereira sell a forged letter of introduction to a young traveler who dreamed of entering high society. The letter bore an ornate seal and a flowing signature that claimed association with a respected European family. It was false in every respect, yet the traveler accepted it with trembling gratitude, convinced that this slip of paper held the key to a future he had imagined for years. Valfierno watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and quiet awe. Pereira, with his unremarkable clothing and weary posture, had transformed himself into a gatekeeper simply by holding that letter with confidence. The traveler's hope did the rest. It was then that Valfierno understood something essential. People often place more weight on symbols than on the unseen truth behind them. A seal, a signature, a gesture of certainty. These could shape the world as effectively as any force of law. This moment, simple as it was, marked the beginning of his education in the mechanics of deception, a lesson far more powerful than anything a formal institution could have offered. He began associating with artists, craftsmen, and copyists who drifted through the city like wandering spirits of imitation. Some painted religious icons for small chapels. Others produced replicas of European artworks for families seeking to display a hint of culture in their homes. In their company, he discovered that imitation required more than skill. It required an understanding of the human gaze, of what people looked for when they admired an image. A painter once told him that a copy need not be perfect, only persuasive. If it captured the essence, the feeling, the suggestion of authenticity, the viewer's mind would supply the rest. This, too, became part of his expanding philosophy. Valfierno learned to watch hands as they painted, to see how light could be recreated through delicate strokes, and how aging could be simulated through layering and subtle marks. He learned the language of pigments, the texture of old varnish, the quiet deception hidden in the grain of a canvas. Yet through all these lessons he understood that the true masterpiece was not the forged object but the narrative surrounding it. Without the right story, even the most skillful copy was merely paint on cloth. With the right story, however, it became treasure. These early encounters shaped his mind into something both precise and fluid, capable of shifting between reality and illusion with ease. He learned that people rarely question what aligns with their desires. If they longed for prestige, they welcomed the possibility of owning a rare piece. If they longed for connection, they embraced the idea that an object carried history. He saw that deception, when applied with elegance, did not even need to hide. It could stand in plain view as long as it was framed correctly. And so he practiced the art of framing, not merely in the sense of surrounding a painting with carved wood, but in shaping the context that made an object believable. He practiced crafting stories, inventing origins, describing journeys across continents, tracing imaginary ownership through families with names that carried the faint echo of nobility. These stories wrapped around each object like a protective shell, shielding it from scrutiny. The lesson deepened when he encountered a craftsman known simply as El Viejo, an aging forger whose hands trembled when resting but turned steady as soon as they touched a brush. El Viejo showed him that deception required humility. The forger must disappear behind the work, leaving no trace of ego. He explained that a counterfeit must not strive to outshine the original. It must instead blend into its historical landscape, adopting the quiet imperfections that time naturally creates. Valfierno watched as El Viejo darkened the edges of a canvas, softened the contours of a face, and introduced small inconsistencies that made the painting feel lived in. It was a revelation. Perfection, he realized, was suspicious. Only truth could be imperfect, and so the illusion of truth required imperfection as well. This insight became another cornerstone of his philosophy, one he would carry across oceans and into the heart of his most ambitious scheme. But the true turning point, the moment that crystallized his understanding, came not from art, but from an encounter with a wealthy merchant who sought to acquire a rare European tapestry. The merchant had already been deceived once and vowed to avoid being fooled again. He summoned experts, scrutinized every thread, asked dozens of questions, yet in the end he purchased the tapestry not because of any proof, but because the story behind it aligned with the image he wished to project. After the transaction, Valfierno realized something profound. Even those who claim to be cautious are driven by hidden desires, and those desires are often stronger than reason. It was not the tapestry the merchant wanted, but the reflection of himself that the tapestry would cast. This understanding opened a new door in Valfierno's mind, revealing the full depth of human vulnerability. Deception was not merely a trick, it was a collaboration between the deceiver and the deceived, each fulfilling a role in a dance guided by the longing for identity, status, or meaning. As these lessons accumulated, a quiet power awakened within him. He no longer saw the world as a fixed structure, but as a fluid stage where narratives shaped reality. His confidence grew, not with arrogance but with a calm certainty born of observation. He understood that he could move through society like a silent author, writing stories into the fabric of objects, planting illusions into the expectations of others. And as he refined his understanding, the blank canvas became a symbol he carried in his mind, representing not the absence of art, but the infinite possibilities waiting to be filled by perception. It is with this image that the part draws to its close, a blank canvas resting in dim light, its surface untouched, yet already carrying the imprint of future illusions. It waits in silence, like a doorway opening toward the unknown, inviting the hand of a man who has just learned the most important truth of his life. The blank canvas remains upright in the dimness, an open surface catching the soft glow of a lamp somewhere beyond the frame, and as the light shifts, it becomes less a waiting object than a doorway into the next ascent of Valfierno's life. Its emptiness echoes the quiet space he carried within himself, the unclaimed territory where his ambitions would soon take form. When he left Argentina, it was not with the restlessness of a man escaping his past, but with the serene confidence of someone stepping into a life he had already rehearsed in his mind. The sea voyage to Europe unfolded slowly, offering long days of reflection and silent observation. He spent the crossing studying the mannerisms of wealthy passengers, the subtle rules of continental etiquette, the tone with which certain men discussed art as though it were a private language. He learned how they moved, how they held their glasses, how they spoke of galleries they had visited and salons they hoped to enter. He absorbed all of this without effort, refining the persona that would serve him well in the world he intended to join. By the time the ship reached Marseille, he no longer carried the tentative air of a newcomer. He had rehearsed himself into existence. Paris welcomed him not with grandeur but with a quiet, steady embrace. The city was still finding its way into the 20th century, its boulevards stretching wide like arteries feeding an enormous, restless heart. It was a place where ambition gathered like smoke above cafes, where poets, merchants, thieves, and aristocrats crossed paths without acknowledging the strange harmony of their coexistence. Valfierno slipped into this atmosphere with the ease of someone who had always belonged to it. His manners, his calm presence, his soft-spoken confidence allowed him to move through circles that might otherwise have been closed to a man of uncertain origin. Yet he did not seek fame or attention. He observed, listened, and learned the underlying structure of a society where art was not merely decoration, but currency, status, and a language spoken fluently by those who understood its power. He met Yves Chaudron during these early Paris years, a forger whose skill rested not in bold strokes, but in quiet mimicry. Chaudron was the kind of man whose presence dissolved the moment one looked away, his face unremarkable, his voice soft, his movements deliberate. But when he painted, his hands carried a precision that bordered on the eerie. Valfierno recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the line between truth and imitation was fragile and often irrelevant. Their partnership did not form through friendship or affection, but through mutual recognition. Chaudron needed someone who understood the architecture of deception. Valfierno needed someone whose skill could give shape to his ideas. Together they formed the nucleus of an audacious vision. The idea came slowly, as most monumental deceptions do, arising first as a whisper of possibility, then as a design, then as a structure so complete it seemed inevitable. Valfierno understood that the greatest treasures in the world were not those that sat behind glass or locked in vaults, but those that held the imagination of the public. The Mona Lisa, though admired, had not yet become the global icon it would one day be, but he sensed its potential. There was something about the face, the delicate smile, the quiet mystery that made it ripe for the kind of legend he wished to create. He knew that value could be magnified by absence, that a missing masterpiece could command a power no existing object could match. And so, the plan began to shape itself around a single idea. He would engineer a theft, not to sell the original painting, but to sell its illusion. The scheme unfolded in layers. First came the forgeries. Chaudron set to work producing not one, but 6 copies of the Mona Lisa. Each was crafted with the meticulous care of a man who understood that the imperfections of age must be simulated with patience. He mixed pigments to match those used centuries earlier, prepared canvases to mirror the weight and texture of Italian originals, and studied every detail of the painting's composition. At the same time, Valfierno cultivated clients, wealthy collectors, who believed themselves connoisseurs but were often blinded by their desire to possess something rare. To each of them he whispered a possibility, a secret offer, a suggestion that the most famous painting in the Louvre could be theirs. He played his role with quiet restraint, never pushing, never promising too openly. The collectors filled in the rest, imagining themselves as hidden participants in a daring acquisition. They saw exclusivity where there was only manipulation, authenticity where there was only design. When he presented the first forgery, he did so with a ceremony of understatement, allowing the weight of the moment to settle on the buyer without forcing its significance. The man accepted the painting with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. Valfierno watched the transaction unfold like a painter studying a finished work. He saw how desire transformed the object before his eyes, how the collector's imagination completed the illusion. The sale confirmed what he had long suspected. The world was ready to believe anything presented with sufficient confidence and subtlety. He repeated this process with each of the 6 forgeries, navigating carefully so that none of the buyers ever crossed each other's paths. The secrecy magnified the thrill, and the thrill magnified the illusion. Each client believed they alone possessed the stolen masterpiece. Each saw themselves as entrusted with something too valuable to display openly. In this way, the deception became self-sustaining. No one would reveal their prize, for to do so would invite scrutiny. Silence protected the fraud more effectively than any hidden vault. As these preparations unfolded, the true theft approached like a stage cue waiting for the right moment. Valfierno himself did not steal the painting. He did not need to. He understood that the execution required someone who lacked his composure but possessed another kind of usefulness, the earnestness of a man like Vincenzo Perugia, who believed he was reclaiming an Italian treasure wrongfully placed in a French museum. Valfierno planted the seed, guided the man's conviction, and then stepped back, allowing events to unfold with the natural momentum of a story well told. When the painting vanished from the Louvre on that quiet August morning, the world gasped. Headlines spread across Europe. Crowds gathered in disbelief, and the empty space on the museum wall, where the Mona Lisa had hung for centuries, suddenly carried more power than the painting itself ever had. Valfierno moved through the city with calm detachment, observing the ripple of his scheme across the fabric of society. The museum tightened its security, investigators scrambled for clues, and journalists speculated wildly. Yet he remained untouched, invisible, a silent presence behind a masterpiece of illusion. The 6 clients who had already purchased their copies now believed they held the stolen original. The painting itself, tucked away by the man who physically removed it, played no real role in Valfierno's profit. The true theft had occurred long before the frame was lifted from the wall. And now, as dawn light stretched through the empty Salon Carré, the room where the Mona Lisa once hung, a stillness settled that felt almost sacred. It was as if the air itself remembered the painting's outline. The absence became a figure, a shape sculpted by light and memory. This image, quiet and haunting, lingers at the close of the part. An empty gallery, the soft echo of footsteps fading, and a bare wall illuminated by the early sun. The empty hall of the Louvre seems to breathe in its own silence, the pale morning light stretching across the wooden floor as though seeking the outline of the vanished painting. And it is through this quiet space that the story moves forward, the absence of the Mona Lisa becoming its own kind of presence. In this emptiness lies the symbol at the core of Valfierno's design, a symbol not of theft, but of perception. The vanished painting becomes an idea, suspended between memory and myth, no longer confined to its frame but expanding outward into the imagination of millions. The world awakens to the news of the disappearance like a collective gasp, yet Valfierno remains still, watching from the shadows as the event takes on a life he never needed to control. He understood from the beginning that symbols are more powerful when they are incomplete, when something essential is missing, allowing the human mind to fill the void with possibilities that surpass reality. The Mona Lisa, gone from its rightful place, became larger than any object could be. It transcended its physical form and entered the territory of legend. This was the heart of his plan, the hidden architecture of his ambition, to transform absence into strength, silence into narrative, illusion into value. As crowds surged into the museum, drawn by curiosity and disbelief, the empty wall became a mirror reflecting their own need for certainty. People stared at the vacant spot as though expecting the painting to reappear, as though their gaze alone could pull it back into existence. But all they found was a void shaped by memory, a rectangular space where the most familiar smile in art history had once hovered. In that void, the painting seemed more alive than ever. Reporters wrote of mystery, of scandal, of outrage. Some speculated that a genius thief had orchestrated the perfect crime. Others whispered of political motives, of foreign plots, of hidden messages. Each explanation added another layer to the myth. The theft became a prism, refracting the anxieties and dreams of the era. And through it all, Valfierno understood that he had tapped into something deeper than art. He had touched the human hunger for stories that explain the world, stories that make reality feel charged with meaning. The symbol grew not from the painting itself but from the reactions it provoked. The Mona Lisa had been admired before, but now it was revered. People who had never bothered to visit the Louvre suddenly longed to see the empty space, to stand before it as if paying respect to an invisible relic. The museum received more visitors than ever. each drawn not by presence but by absence. And in this paradox lay the genius of Valfierno's scheme. A stolen original could be replaced eventually, but a stolen idea became immortal. The world no longer sought the painting alone, it sought the meaning of the disappearance, the story behind the void. Valfierno knew that myths flourish where facts are scarce. The painting's absence allowed every rumor to flourish, every theory to breathe. It was as though the stolen object had split into countless versions of itself, each lodged in the imagination of a different observer. In this multiplication of meaning, the forgeries he had already sold gained weight. Their buyers, believing themselves to possess the original, now felt the thrill of owning history's most infamous secret. Valfierno watched the unfolding chaos with quiet detachment, aware that the true power of the moment was beyond his control and yet aligned perfectly with his intentions. He understood that symbols operate on a different plane than actions. A theft is a fact. A missing masterpiece is a story. And stories, once released, cannot be contained. They move through societies like invisible currents, shaping conversations, altering perception, gathering influence. The Mona Lisa's disappearance became a turning point in modern art's relationship with the public, elevating the painting from a respected work to an icon of global culture. Its subtle smile, once admired only by those who stood before it, now lingered in the collective imagination as a mysterious beacon of lost beauty. People debated its meaning, its value, its fate. They argued over theories that stretched from the reasonable to the fantastic. The painting became a presence precisely because it could no longer be seen. Yet the symbol extended beyond the painting. It wrapped itself around Valfierno's own identity, shaping the man he had become. He saw in the uproar confirmation of the lesson he had learned long ago, that authenticity, while revered, is rarely understood. What people worship is not truth but the semblance of truth. They embrace the illusion that aligns with their desires and reject the reality that challenges them. Valfierno had given the world an illusion so vast that it transcended his own involvement. He had become a ghost in his own narrative, a silent conductor orchestrating a symphony of assumptions. The genius of his plan lay in its subtlety. He had never attempted to steal the painting himself. He never touched the masterpiece. Yet he had orchestrated an illusion that reshaped its meaning forever. As the global conversation grew more fevered, as newspapers printed sketches and speculations, as investigators pursued countless false leads, Valfierno allowed himself to drift further into anonymity. He knew that staying visible would jeopardize the entire structure he had built. Instead, he let the world paint its own portrait of the thief, each brushstroke drawn from imagination rather than truth. And so the symbol of the crime expanded, absorbing him, the museum, the painting, and the public into a single narrative clouded by uncertainty. In time, crates were sealed in quiet rooms, their contents hidden beneath layers of straw and cloth. One such crate, nailed shut with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a craftsman, carried not the original painting but one of the many illusions Valfierno had already set loose in the world. The final sound of the hammer striking wood echoes faintly at the end of this part, a reminder that the power of a symbol often rests not in what it contains but in what it promises. The faint ringing of the final hammer strike dissolves into the quiet drift of time, becoming an indistinct vibration that seems to move forward with Valfierno himself as he slips away from the center of the story he has engineered, passing through the years like a man made of breath rather than substance. The crate, sealed and anonymous, stands as a silent witness to the transition that follows, a threshold between the act and the aftermath. It is in the wake of the theft, in the long shadows cast by the absence of the Mona Lisa, that Valfierno enters the next stage of his life, a stage marked not by triumph but by a slow, almost imperceptible descent into distance and obscurity. The world continues its fevered search for answers, but he moves in the opposite direction, away from the commotion, stepping carefully through the corridors of cities and across borders, without leaving more than a faint impression behind him. His life becomes a sequence of transitions, each one smoothing away sharp edges, each one erasing a little more of the man he once was. In the early years after the theft, he experiences a kind of muted prosperity. The sales of the forgeries, already completed before the painting even left the museum, provide him with enough wealth to move comfortably through Europe. He drifts through Paris, Barcelona, Rome, and Venice, settling nowhere, always observing, always adjusting his appearance and manner to suit the expectations of those around him. He is a man without a fixed center, built from layers of cultivated impressions. In rooms filled with smoke and murmured conversations, he speaks sparingly, offering only what is necessary. He carries with him the calm certainty of someone who understands that his greatest work is already complete and that the world will spend decades attempting to decipher it. Yet even this quiet confidence begins to shift as time passes. The thrill of the scheme fades, replaced by the subtle weight of distance. The painting, still missing, grows larger in the public imagination, but he himself grows smaller, slipping further from the narrative with each passing year. The stages of his life unfold with the slow rhythm of a tide, moving him from youth shaped by imitation into adulthood defined by manipulation, and finally toward a later period marked by a kind of dissolution. In youth, he had absorbed the world around him like a sponge, forming himself from the gestures and ambitions of others. In adulthood, he had wielded these observations like tools, constructing an illusion so intricate that it reshaped the meaning of art itself. But in the years following the theft, his identity begins to lose its sharpness. The roles he once played with precision now feel heavier, harder to maintain. He shifts from place to place, sometimes under different names, sometimes under the same, though few ever remember him clearly. He becomes a man who exists in the margins of records, appearing briefly, then vanishing before any lasting impression can take root. As he moves through these stages, he finds himself reflecting on the nature of the life he has chosen. The scheme he orchestrated required anonymity for success, but anonymity, once embraced, has a way of consuming the person who seeks it. He had crafted illusions for others, but over time he becomes an illusion to himself, a figure glimpsed in passing reflections, a presence that feels both familiar and distant. In certain quiet moments, perhaps in a small inn overlooking a fog-covered harbor, perhaps in a cafe where he watches strangers talk about the theft with animated gestures, he senses the subtle erosion of his own identity. He knows too well that a life built on deception cannot sustain the warmth of belonging. The very qualities that allowed him to create one of the most elegant schemes in art history now leave him drifting, unanchored, unable to return to any version of himself that existed before. Those who meet him in these later years often describe him in vague terms. A polite man, well-dressed, soft-spoken, with a gaze that seems to look slightly beyond the person in front of him. He remains composed, but no longer with the purposeful control of a man executing a grand plan. Instead, his composure becomes a kind of resignation, a stillness born from having lived too long on the edge of visibility. He carries with him no obvious signs of regret, yet there is a quiet melancholy in the way he moves, as though each step is taken with the awareness that he has already played the defining role of his life and now must wander the empty stage that remains. Rumors begin to follow him, drifting like loose threads through the cities he passes. Some claim he lived for years in the south of France, spending afternoons in quiet contemplation by the sea. Others insist he returned to Argentina under a different name, slipping into the anonymity of the very streets that once shaped him. A few say he vanished in Spain, or that he traveled briefly through North Africa before disappearing altogether. No account is certain. No detail is confirmed, and this uncertainty becomes part of the final truth of his life. A man who orchestrated an illusion became, in the end, an illusion himself. The stories of his movements grow increasingly vague with time, dissolving into hearsay and fading memories. He is seen, perhaps, in a train station on a rainy evening, carrying a single suitcase. He is heard, maybe, speaking quietly in a guest house near Lisbon. He is remembered, dimly, as a figure who once spoke with unusual knowledge about art, but did not reveal his own involvement in the greatest art deception of the age. As these fragments accumulate, they form not a portrait, but a haze, a clouded vision of a life passing quietly into obscurity. And so this part ends with a lingering image, a rumor half-spoken, drifting like a thin veil across a fading landscape, neither confirmed nor denied, carried forward only by the breath of those who once thought they glimpsed him. It is a detail unresolved, floating gently at the edge of memory, leading toward the next breath of the story. The drifting rumor hangs in the air, weightless and unclaimed, and as it stretches forward, it becomes the bridge to the next movement of his life, leading not toward clarity but toward those who would one day guard the fragments of his story. Eduardo de Valfierno, now more shadow than man, more echo than presence, moves quietly through the years, and in his fading steps, a philosophy slowly crystallizes, one shaped not by moral conviction or artistic devotion, but by an enduring belief in the fluidity of truth. He had long understood that people cling to the stories that comfort them, that identity is a construct shaped as much by desire as by fact, and that the world is far more willing to embrace a compelling illusion than a mundane reality. This understanding, which had guided every action of his life, becomes the quiet compass that directs him through his final decades. It is a philosophy without doctrine, a belief unspoken yet deeply lived, that truth is not a fixed point but a moving river, and that those who learn to navigate its currents can shape the world in ways unseen by those who demand absolute certainty. As he drifted deeper into anonymity, the task of preserving his story shifted to others, figures who moved at the periphery of his life but held the power to carry fragments of his existence into the future. Among them was Karl Decker, a journalist who would one day claim to have known the man behind the Mona Lisa scheme. Decker's account, recorded years after the events had unfolded, became the closest thing history possesses to a testimony, though even his words are shrouded in uncertainty. Some believe he embellished the tale for sensational effect. Others argue he captured the essence of a man who lived by creating illusions. Valfierno himself might have smiled at this ambiguity, pleased that even the guardian of his story was caught between truth and invention. Decker's role was not to prove or explain, but to preserve, in faint outlines, the shape of a life designed to evade definition. He became the custodian of a narrative that refused to settle, holding in his hands the delicate balance between fact and suggestion, between memory and myth. The philosophy that Valfierno carried within him was threaded through Decker's account like a muted undertone. In their supposed conversations, Valfierno spoke of art not as a sacred object, but as a vessel for human emotion, a mirror in which people sought reflections of themselves. He understood that value was not inherent in a painting's brushstrokes, but assigned by the collective imagination. He believed that authenticity, while revered, was irrelevant to the emotional impact of a piece. What mattered was the story attached to it, the aura surrounding it, the belief it inspired. In this sense, his forgeries were not simply deceptions, but variations on a theme, each one crafted with the purpose of fulfilling a desire. The true masterpiece, in his view, was not the object but the narrative woven around it. And this belief, subtle yet profound, shaped all that followed. Other guardians emerged in quieter ways, art dealers who remembered him as a man with an uncanny eye, collectors who recalled a soft-spoken figure offering insights that seemed both informed and detached, museum curators who noticed his lingering gaze as he stood before certain paintings, observing them not as objects of devotion, but as elements within a larger structure of perception. These individuals did not know him intimately, yet their memories formed the scaffolding of what would become the legend of Eduardo de Valfierno. Each recollection was incomplete, each detail imperfect, yet together they preserved the essence of a man who had intentionally obscured himself. Their testimonies, scattered and uncertain, became the mosaic through which later generations would attempt to glimpse the truth. In these later years, Valfierno's belief in the power of illusion deepened. He saw how easily stories outlived the people who created them, how myths took root in the collective consciousness and grew into towering structures that overshadowed the facts beneath them. He understood that the theft of the Mona Lisa had become something far larger than he ever anticipated. The painting, now recovered and returned to its frame, no longer belonged solely to the realm of art. It had become a global icon, a symbol of mystery, vulnerability, and the strange magnetism of human desire. The very act of its disappearance had elevated it beyond measure. The world's fascination with the theft revealed something profound. People longed not only for beauty, but for stories that explained their own longing. And in this longing, Valfierno saw a reflection of his own philosophical core. Illusion was not deception. It was a form of truth shaped by emotion. Authenticity, he believed, lay not in the object but in the experience it provoked. Though he never expressed these thoughts in writing, they were preserved indirectly through the guardian figures who drifted through his life. The dealers who recalled his remarks about the nature of value, the artists who remembered his quiet fascination with the imperfection of aging varnish, the journalists who captured his enigmatic tone. Each carried a piece of him forward, even as he himself slipped further into obscurity. In this way, his philosophy survived him, not as a doctrine, but as an atmosphere, a faint presence that continued to influence those who contemplated the blurred boundaries between truth and illusion. And so this part arrives at its lingering image, a notebook resting on a table, its pages yellowing in the soft light of an afternoon, filled with words that may or may not be true. It lies open, as if waiting for someone to interpret the story preserved within its fragile lines, a story shaped as much by silence as by confession. The yellowing pages rest in the dim afternoon light, their edges curling slightly as though they have absorbed the weight of the years, and as the stillness deepens around them, the story shifts once more, moving toward the final arc of Valfierno's life, where the silence thickens and the contours of his existence blur into uncertainty. Those pages, fragile and fading, become a threshold into the mystery that surrounds his ending, for they contain not a conclusion but a series of fragments, suggestions, and hints that lead only toward more questions. It is through this incomplete record that the narrator steps into the last known movements of Eduardo de Valfierno, a man who spent his life mastering the art of invisibility and now approaches the final act of that quiet vanishing. Death, when it comes into a story built on illusion, does not arrive with clarity. It comes instead as an echo, a dim footstep in an empty corridor, a rumor half-whispered by those who once knew him, or believed they did. Valfierno leaves behind no official record of his final days, no documented burial, no confirmed testament. Instead, his last chapter is constructed from silence, from the absence of evidence and the continued drift of stories that refuse to settle into certainty. Some who encountered him in his later years reported that he appeared thinner, more withdrawn, as though the brilliance of his earlier ambitions had receded into a private distance known only to him. They spoke of a man who carried no visible fear, yet moved with the cautious grace of someone who understood the fragility of his own existence. He was seen in cafes, alone, stirring a cup of coffee with a slow deliberation that suggested he was listening to something within himself rather than to any sound around him. A few described him as contemplative, murmuring quiet observations about art, about value, about the strange fate of objects once believed lost. Others suspected a deeper exhaustion, a weariness that comes not from guilt or regret but from the natural decline of a life lived perpetually in the shadows. Yet these accounts, like everything attached to his name, are clouded by the uncertainty of memory. The witnesses may have been mistaken. They may have projected their own interpretations onto a man who had always encouraged others to see what they wished to see. There are stories that he died in Argentina, returning under a false name to the city where his understanding of illusion first took shape. Some believe he passed away quietly in a modest home, surrounded by nothing that hinted at the extraordinary deception he once orchestrated. Others insist he ended his life in Europe, perhaps in France or Spain, living out his final days in a rented room overlooking a street where no one recognized him. A few say he died in poverty. Others claim he remained comfortably supported by the wealth he had accumulated. None of these accounts can be verified. They exist as competing narratives, each one plausible, each one imperfect, each one cast into the world by a different voice, seeking to claim some small piece of the man who crafted the most elegant illusion of his century. The truth, as always with Valfierno, remains concealed beneath layers of speculation and suggestion. What is certain is that the world did not notice his passing. There were no headlines, no announcements, no formal investigations. The disappearance of the man behind the scheme was far quieter than the disappearance of the painting itself. If he left a last word, it was never recorded. If he attempted to confess his role, no one preserved the details. His death, like his life, seems to dissolve into the background, leaving behind only a faint impression, the suggestion of a man slipping beyond the reach of those who sought to define him. In this silence lies a kind of symmetry. The disappearance of the painting had transformed it into a global symbol, but the disappearance of the man transformed him into a shadow, an enigma whose existence became a story told only in fragments. It is as though he understood that a life built on illusion must end without spectacle, without resolution, without the finality of a clear farewell. And yet, even in the uncertainty of his ending, there remains one last echo, a sentence attributed to him, reported by one who claimed to have heard it, that the greatest truths are the ones no one looks for. Whether he spoke these words or whether they were invented later to complete the myth does not matter. The sentence fits the shape of his life, aligning with the quiet philosophy that guided him from the beginning. It suggests a man who understood that the world rarely sees the forces that sculpt its stories, that people are drawn to the visible drama while the deeper movements remain hidden. If these were indeed his last words, they reveal a final flicker of introspection. If they were invented, they nonetheless capture the essence of the man who once redefined deception through subtlety rather than spectacle. As the story moves toward its close, the lingering image is not of Valfierno himself, but of a distant hallway, empty, with soft footsteps fading gradually until they dissolve into silence. The corridor stretches onward, illuminated only by a thin shaft of light from an unseen window, and the steps recede with the steady rhythm of someone walking out of sight, disappearing into the quiet, leaving behind only the memory of their passing. It is in this dissolution that his story finds its final breath, a breath as calm and inscrutable as the life he lived. The fading footsteps drift into silence, dissolving into the long corridor of time, and as their echo vanishes, the story enters its final movement, where the life of Eduardo de Valfierno no longer belongs to the man who lived it but to the world that continues to interpret it. In this last part, the narrative widens, gathering the threads that trail behind him like faint, unraveling strands, tracing the legacy of a figure who succeeded not through force or notoriety, but through a subtle manipulation of perception so precise that it continues to shape the way we think about authenticity, deception, and the quiet power of absence. It is here, in the aftermath of his disappearance, that Valfierno's influence becomes most apparent, for his story, fragmented, uncertain, and often contested, has endured far longer than anyone could have predicted. The man himself left no clear imprint, but the illusion he engineered continues to ripple across history with the persistent calm of a soft tide. The Mona Lisa, once a respected Renaissance portrait admired mainly by connoisseurs, was forever transformed by the theft. Its disappearance ignited a fascination that surpassed reason, elevating the painting from an artifact into a global icon, recognized even by those who know nothing of art. When it was recovered and returned to its frame, it carried with it the weight of its own legend, a legend shaped not only by the thief who physically removed it, but by the mind behind the larger design. Valfierno's role in this transformation remains uncertain, debated, and at times dismissed, yet the essence of his influence lingers in the narrative that surrounds the painting. The world continues to recount the story of its theft with a mixture of awe and disbelief, often embellishing the details, often blurring fact with conjecture, and in this blurred space lies the quiet triumph of the man who understood the power of suggestion. He demonstrated that a well-crafted story can shape history as effectively as any monumental act, and that the perception of truth often matters more than truth itself. Over the decades, scholars, writers, and curious observers have returned to the tale of Eduardo de Valfierno, drawn not by evidence but by the magnetism of the unknown. His name appears in historical accounts like a shadow slipping across the page, present, then gone, never fully solid. Some argue he was a genius of psychological insight. Others claim he was merely a fabrication, an invention of journalistic imagination. Yet even this debate reinforces the very principle that defined his life, that ambiguity, when sustained, acquires its own kind of authority. The uncertainty surrounding him becomes part of the story's allure. The line between the real and the invented blurs, leaving those who study him caught in a delicate balance between skepticism and fascination. In this tension, his legacy endures, for it mirrors the very illusions he once crafted with such precision. The painting itself has become a symbol not only of artistic mastery, but of the strange relationship between visibility and value. Millions of visitors stand before it each year, gazing through a protective barrier at the most famous smile in the world. Some admire it sincerely, others wonder aloud why it has captured such global attention. But beneath these reactions lies the deeper truth. The Mona Lisa is revered not simply because of its artistic qualities, but because its story has been enriched by the drama of its absence, by the theft that thrust it into the realm of legend. Valfierno's scheme, whether fully understood or even acknowledged, helped shape that narrative. He constructed a framework through which the world would perceive the painting, a framework that persists long after his own presence faded from memory. In this enduring legacy, there is a quiet irony. The man who engineered one of the boldest conceptual deceptions in art history did so not to be remembered but to disappear. He created a narrative so compelling that it overshadowed his own identity, allowing him to slip into obscurity while the world continued to grapple with the illusions he set in motion. His life becomes a meditation on the nature of influence, suggesting that the most powerful acts are not always those that demand recognition. Sometimes the greatest impact is made by those who remain unseen, who allow their ideas to move through the world without attaching their names to them. Valfierno understood that stories outlive people, and that the truest measure of a legacy lies in the persistence of the narrative, not the presence of the storyteller. As time stretches onward, the figure of Eduardo de Valfierno continues to hover on the threshold between truth and myth, a presence felt more strongly for the very reason that it cannot be fully defined. His name resurfaces in discussions about forgery, authenticity, and the complex relationship between art and value. His scheme becomes a touchstone for examining the fragile nature of trust in a world where appearances often guide perception. And the Mona Lisa, always watching with her enigmatic gaze, remains the silent witness to the repercussions of his design. The painting's fame, now so deeply woven into global culture, carries within it the faint echo of the man who once understood that absence could amplify presence, that uncertainty could deepen fascination, and that illusion could become a lasting form of truth. In the final breath of the story, there is no grand conclusion, no definitive answer to the question of who Eduardo de Valfierno truly was. Instead, his legacy settles into the quiet space between imagination and fact, inviting each listener to interpret his life according to their own understanding of truth. The last image lingers like a soft exhale, the Mona Lisa glowing behind its protective glass, surrounded by a sea of faces, its smile as unchanged as ever, its mystery deepened by the centuries, its meaning shaped in part by the distant footsteps of a man who once walked away from the world and left behind a legend that refuses to fade. The story does not end, even when its last part has settled into silence, for certain lives continue to echo long after their final footsteps have faded, and Eduardo de Valfierno is one of those figures whose presence lingers in the quiet spaces of history, shaping thought in ways that are almost imperceptible yet undeniably persistent. As the narrative drifts beyond its structured conclusion, it enters a realm where legacy becomes less about chronology and more about resonance, where the man himself dissolves, but the questions he raised continue to move through time with the steady patience of a slow-moving tide. His life, shaped by illusion and guided by an intimate understanding of human desire, becomes a lens through which we can examine the fragile bond between truth and belief, a bond that governs not only art, but the world itself. When we look at the Mona Lisa today, framed carefully behind layers of glass, surrounded by countless visitors holding their breath as they lean in for a moment of connection, we are not merely witnessing a painting, we are witnessing the accumulated weight of its absences, the history of its disappearance, and the ambiguity of the man who orchestrated a scheme so unusual that it blurred the line between crime and idea. This, more than anything, is the enduring mark he left upon the world, the understanding that meaning is not fixed, that it shifts according to the stories we attach to it, and that those stories often have origins far more delicate and invisible than we imagine. Even now, as scholars debate his existence and biographers attempt to stitch together the loose fragments of his life, Valfierno remains elusive, a figure who refuses to settle into the comfort of certainty. Perhaps that is why his story endures. The human mind gravitates toward mysteries that cannot be solved, toward questions that resist the finality of answers. In Valfierno, we find not a traditional villain or a misunderstood hero, but a reminder of the complexities that define human ambition. He operated in the space between admiration and deception, between the desire to possess beauty and the realization that beauty often lies in the idea rather than the object. His story forces us to consider the nature of authenticity, not only in art but in our own perceptions. How often do we cling to illusions because they offer meaning? How often do we accept stories simply because they align with our hopes? These questions ripple silently through the narrative he left behind, inviting contemplation rather than resolution. And in this continuation beyond the final chapter, we sense the subtle presence of the man himself, not in facts, not in documented truths, but in the lingering uncertainty that surrounds him. He becomes a companion to the many mysteries of history, those figures whose outlines grow sharper the further we step back, whose influence is felt more strongly in the absence of definitive proof. If he were here to witness the ongoing fascination with his story, perhaps he would smile gently, recognizing that the true measure of his legacy lies not in whether he is believed, but in the persistence of belief itself. His life demonstrates that a well-constructed illusion, once released into the world, can take root in the imagination with a strength that outlasts the person who created it. It can move across generations, acquiring depth with each retelling, becoming less about the original event and more about the meaning that people continue to find in it. As the narrative stretches into this final reflection, the image settles into place. The Mona Lisa, illuminated softly in her protected chamber, silently observing the world that gathers before her each day. Her enigmatic smile remains unchanged, yet the meaning of that smile grows richer with time, shaped by every gaze, every whisper, every interpretation. Somewhere in that quiet expression, if one looks closely enough, there is the faintest suggestion of the story we have followed, the echo of a man who understood the power of what slips just beyond view. And though he himself has vanished from the world, leaving behind no grave, no final testament, no traceable path, his influence lingers like the last light of dusk diffuse, soft, and serene. The story continues only in this way now, not through additional events, but through the quiet persistence of the ideas he left behind, ideas that move gently through history like a long breath held just beneath the surface of time. And so the breath continues, stretching softly beyond the places where a life is usually permitted to end, drifting into the quiet regions where history and memory coexist without contradiction. In this extended stillness, Valfierno's presence becomes something lighter than narrative, something closer to atmosphere than biography, as though he were not merely a man who lived but a subtle pressure on the way the world interprets itself. For even now, long after his name has slipped into the margins, his story hums beneath the surface of countless conversations about art, identity, truth, and the intricate patterns of desire that shape human behavior. It is not the details of his life that endure, those have scattered like dust, but the questions he left behind, questions that move with gentle persistence through museums, lecture halls, private collections, and the minds of those who stand before paintings wondering not just what they see, but why they believe what they see. In this continued unfolding, the legacy of his deception expands into a broader meditation on the nature of perception itself. The world, in all its complexity, often behaves like a gallery filled with objects whose meanings change according to the eyes that study them. A painting gains value because someone declares it valuable. A story becomes true because people need it to be true. A man becomes a legend because his disappearance creates a silence that others cannot resist filling. Valfierno understood these mechanisms instinctively, not through academic study or philosophical debate, but through the lived experience of watching how people reached for certainty in uncertain spaces. His life, shaped by illusion yet grounded in a calm understanding of human nature, becomes a mirror held up to the world, reflecting not deception, but the deep human inclination to seek stories that give shape to the unspoken parts of existence. Even now, as countless visitors flow through the Louvre, their steps echoing softly across polished floors, the Mona Lisa gazes outward with the serenity of someone who knows that her story has long surpassed her physical form. Her smile, faint and inscrutable, carries within it the accumulated centuries of admiration, analysis, speculation, and longing. But beneath that, in the quietest layer of her presence, lies the shadow of the years when she was absent, when her empty frame compelled the world to reassess what art meant, what value meant, what mystery meant. And woven into that absence is the soft, almost imperceptible influence of the man who recognized that the power of a masterpiece does not lie solely in its existence, but in the story that surrounds it. Valfierno's scheme, whether fully believed or endlessly debated, illuminates the fragile architecture of meaning that supports the world of art, revealing how easily the foundation shifts when a single object is removed. Perhaps this is why his story persists, because it touches a universal truth about the way people shape reality. We do not merely observe the world, we interpret it, layering our own hopes, fears, desires, and memories onto the scenes before us. And in that act of interpretation, illusion becomes a form of truth, not a falsehood, but a reflection of the inner landscape. Valfierno understood this with the clarity of someone who moved through life quietly, watching how people built their identities through the objects they admired and the stories they believed. He saw that authenticity, while revered, was rarely examined deeply. What mattered was the feeling of possession, the sense of connection, the belief that one held something rare. This insight, once applied to the Mona Lisa, reverberated far beyond his own lifetime, influencing the very way people think about art, its value, and the mysteries that give it power. As this extended reflection continues, the narrative slows into a gentle, contemplative drift, settling into the understanding that some stories are not meant to conclude with clarity. Instead, they remain open, inviting continual return, continual reinterpretation. Valfierno's story is one such story. It lingers not because it is complete, but because it is incomplete in a way that feels honest to the nature of human curiosity. The unresolved questions. Did he truly exist as described? Did he speak those final words? Did he walk the streets of Paris with quiet satisfaction or deep fatigue? Become part of the story's texture, woven into the spaces where certainty gives way to imagination. And so the final image extends itself once more, the soft light of a museum hall at closing time, the Mona Lisa resting in her silent glow, the last few visitors drifting away as the room empties. In the quiet that follows, her expression seems to shift almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging the stories that have carried her through the centuries. Somewhere in that stillness, if one listens closely enough, there is the faint echo of footsteps, the same footsteps that disappeared down a distant corridor, reminding us that some lives continue long after they have ended, carried forward not by evidence but by the quiet persistence of the mysteries they leave behind.